This is going to be a quick little lesson giving you a little bit more information about constructors that we talked about in earlier videos. So you recall the purpose of a constructor is to do the initializing for your class. Anything that the methods in the class assume has been taken care of has to happen in the constructors, because you have no idea when you write the code for your class what order the methods might be executed in. People could call those methods in any order, call one of them more than once, skip them all together. You've written your code in little chunks that the calling programs can pick and choose. That means if any method assumes that something already has a value, you have to have taken care of it at the time that the object was first created as an instance of that class, when that was created using the new keyword. In other words, in your constructor. So the main purpose of a constructor is to set a value for any state values that you may have in your class. Now, sometimes it's useful to have many different ways to create an object. That means you might have many different constructors. For example, let's use an example that was something that I put in the last practice video. Suppose you've got a class called grades, and it keeps 3 state variables, one for each of 3 possible test scores. Test 1, Test 2, Test 3. You may want to be able to create a grades object by passing in all 3 scores, like we did in our practice video. Or maybe you only want to pass in 1 score and take a default grade in the other 2. Let's see how that would work. You could have the following constructors. Suppose you had public grades, int t1, t2, t3, and then you set your 3 state variables. Test 1 equals what you passed in as T1, Test 2 is what you passed in for T2, Test 3 is what you passed in for T3, and so on. And then suppose you had one where you only passed in 1 integer. Public grades int T1. Well, maybe you're going to use that value that you passed in for your first state variable, Test 1, and you'll use a default value of 85 for each of the other 2. Okay, great. I've now got 2 constructors, one that takes int, 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 and one that takes only a single integer. This is certainly a perfectly acceptable way to implement those constructors. Then, to create an object using those constructors, somewhere in another program, maybe in your main method, you've got grades, my grades, equals new grades of 100, 90, and 80. And grades, your grades, equals new grades, only 100. At the time that Java executes your program, it looks and it says, oh, you want a new grades. I'd better see what the definition of the grades class is. Do I have a constructor that takes, let's see, you gave it 3 things, an integer, an integer, and an integer. If it finds a constructor with int, 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 it'll execute that. In this one, it says, oh, you only passed 1 thing. I'm going to look for a constructor that just has an int, and it'll find it just fine. Now, I can make constructors reference each other if I want. Another way to implement exactly the same thing as the previous example is to have one constructor reference another, using the this keyword. This always refers to the current object in Java, and we usually leave it out because it's implicit. It's understood that if you don't say this, you're talking about the current object. So let's see, my first constructor, no change at all. Public grades, 3 ints. It should say int t1, int t2, int t3. That's a typo in my PowerPoint. Don't you make that mistake or Eclipse will complain. And I set test 1, test 2, and test 3 to have the values that were passed in. But look at how I changed the second constructor. Still passing in only 1 integer, but now instead of saying test 1 equals T1, test 2 equals 85, test 3 equals 85, I take advantage of the fact that I've written another constructor already, that if I gave it 3 values, it knows what to do with them. So I'm going to call that constructor. How do I do that? This. This refers to my current object. My current object is the instance of grades, so it looks for a constructor for grades that takes 3 parameters. This one's an int, this one's an int, this one's an int. So, in other words, it passes three values here. Passes whatever you gave it as T1, then an 85, then another 85. So this works exactly the same as the previous example. Sometimes it's nicer to get one constructor working exactly the way you want it, and then have the other constructors reference it, so that you don't have to keep reinventing the same code. Now, there's limitations on multiple constructors. You can create as many constructors as you want, but each one has to have a different signature, meaning two of them can't have exactly the same number of parameters of exactly the same types. For example, you could have a constructor that only passed in the first score, using defaults for the other two, but you can't also have one that only passes in the second test score, with defaults for the first and third. Because if you did that, Java wouldn't know when you did code like this, my grades equals new grades 100. It would say, let me look for an integer that takes an int. Let me look for a constructor that takes an int. And it would say, oh, I've got one where that int is test1. I've got one where that int is test2. It has no way of telling which one you wanted. So it doesn't allow you to do it at all. If you have multiple constructors, and you can have as many as you want, each one has to have a different signature, meaning either a different number of parameters or different types of those parameters. If you had something with a single parameter and it was an int, you could also have one with a single parameter that was a double. But you can't have two that are just an int. All right, hopefully that helps you learn something about constructors, because you'll need to be doing multiple constructors on our programming assignments in this lesson.